All right, so today we are going to talk about what makes Laravel so dang awesome. And I think this is a huge misconception, even for really experienced PHP developers, right? The ones that are really technically good, like technical to a T, and they can work in big projects. You know, they do the TDD stuff, you know, they do the dependency injection, they never use anything like facades, they do just everything right. And they'll get to like this point, and this isn't everybody, this is just like one of those things you'll see, is there's a point where some really good developers start bagging on Laravel a bit, you know, saying it's not as good as something like Symfony. And this confuses me all the time. I don't understand this because Laravel and Symfony serve two different purposes. So to give you an idea of Symfony is a PHP component library. That's one side of Symfony, along with a framework. The Symfony component libraries are some of the best components out there. They are very architecturally sound, extremely portable between frameworks and common CMSs. Like Drupal uses Symfony, Laravel heavily uses Symfony. I'm pretty sure CakePHP uses Symfony. Slim framework uses Symfony. They don't use the framework of Symfony though. They use Symfony components. Now, to give you an idea, for those of you who are familiar with Laravel, Laravel also has a component library. It's called Illuminate. And so you can use all of Illuminate stuff in Laravel itself, but you can usually use those Illuminate components outside of Laravel. Like collections are extremely easy to use outside of Laravel, which I love. I love that about Laravel. Every single project I do in or outside of Laravel, I'll always import Laravel Illuminate support components. And specifically, I love importing the collections component. It's amazing. Laravel collections are amazing. There's no arguing with that. They're awesome. They help out tremendously in cleaning up code. So what about everything else in Laravel? Like, why does it get a bad name? And it does, and it's obviously the most popular PHP framework in the world, but why does it not have the same type of reputation that Symfony has, you know, as the architecturally sound, you know, framework that is just solid on all fronts, right? Well, here's why. Symfony is extremely unbiased. Laravel, on the other hand, it is, I'm not going to say extremely biased, the framework itself is extremely biased. It still gives you tons of opportunity, and extreme's a strong word. The Laravel framework is pretty biased. It still gives you a lot of opportunities to do whatever you need to, and it doesn't make anything rigid, so it's still architecturally sound, but it's biased. And it's biased that you have to use the Laravel service container. Like, that's crazy. It's not really crazy. To give you an idea, frameworks like Slim, where it's a micro framework, it allows you to use any PHP service container you want that follows the PHP PSR standards for service containers. So PHP standards PSR, they define a best practice or recommended PHP service container. So frameworks that follow really good architectural practices, like perfectly follow them. And more than that, it's not necessarily architectural practices, it's eliminating the biases. They'll let you trade out just about anything, and the whole of the application. Slim is a perfect example. Slim 4 is a perfect example of this. I have a whole Slim 4 authentication series. I basically, by the time we got to the end of that, we set up a mini Laravel from Slim. And what was cool about it was we slowly turned Slim into a Laravel architecture. So to give you an idea, here's what we did. We started off just normal going through Slim, and then we set up the service provider's architecture from scratch. Then we set up just some helper functions that we borrowed both from Laravel and added our own. Then we added laid templates from Laravel. Then we added Eloquent from Laravel. And then we go on and we add really, really cool features like, like migrations and factories and seeders. But we don't use Laravel for those. We used Cake PHP. We used Finks. For the service container, we used the service container called PHPDI. It's PHPDI package. It stands for PHP Dependency Injection, which is not what Laravel uses. Laravel uses their own custom service container. So we use this PHPDI service container. Then we pulled in and we set up our own implementation of a Slim console, right? And we were able to use Symfony for that, which is also what Laravel does, but they extend Symfony and they make Artisan out of the Symfony console component. And then we pulled in Laravel validation, from Illuminate validators. We pulled in, what else did we pull in? We pulled in a few other things. The Symfony session, so we were able to do session like flash errors in a very similar way to what Laravel does, but we were able to do it ourselves. We did a custom implementation for factories, but we used a Faker library with a guy who has a crazy last name that I can't pronounce, but it's a really amazing package if you guys want to check that out. That is in the Slim 4 series. And then, we pulled in different components. First off, we're using Slim, so it's using the Slim router, the Slim routing proxy collector, all that stuff. We're using the PHPDI service container. We're using the Symfony session and console. We were using Laravel validators, Laravel collections, and Laravel Eloquent. We were using Cake PHP's Finks for migrations, and just as a quick thing to set up seeders and migrations. And it got really, really cool, really fast. And honestly, it's my favorite series we've done yet, is it teaches so much about how powerful it can be when you follow PSR, when you follow PHP best practice standards. So to go round circle with this, something like Slim is a lot less biased. Something like Laravel is extraordinarily, and I will use extremely in comparison to Slim, right? And Laravel is, it's insane, honestly. It's insane. Even though Slim is really, really cool, and I highly recommend using it. It's an amazing framework. Now, Symfony itself is extremely cool. It has some amazing components. I haven't used the framework that much, but what I have used with is I know it's not a Laravel. Cake PHP, whatever. Codeigniter, puke in my mouth. Codeigniter. Sorry guys, I'm not a Codeigniter fan. Sorry to all you Codeigniter fans. I am not one. And then you go back round circle. So I'll break it down to this. You have Symfony, Slim, and Laravel. What's the difference between those three? And right now, those three are what I would consider what makes up the software development. I'm just gonna say higher level, but that doesn't really make sense. What makes those three frameworks, Slim PHP, Laravel, and Symfony, and their components, are what make up the frameworks in PHP, in my opinion, that mean something and are truly valuable in their own sense. And as I'm sure there's more out there I haven't used, but they also all do very different things. And I think it really exemplifies what makes Laravel amazing. So if you look at Slim, there is no front end. There is no database connection. There is no service container. There is nothing. It's a micro framework. It means it accepts a request, it handles a request, and then it dispatches the resolved action for that request and returns a response. That's a micro framework. Everything else in Slim, you have to manually put it in, which can be extremely powerful because it's unbiased, extraordinarily unbiased. You can hook just about anything into it that was built right, that was built correctly. And you can extract just about anything from it to anywhere else as long as it accepts the PSR standards. Really, really cool. Now, Symfony is, it's not used nearly as much as a framework as its component library is used. Its components are phenomenal. Drupal, Laravel, Slim 4, obviously Symfony itself, and the list goes on and on. Every PHP thing out there that's built right and tries to follow PSR, at least to an extent, they all utilize Symfony's component library. So where does that leave Laravel, right? Laravel is, and here's the common misconception. There's two things that make Laravel phenomenal. And not phenomenal because I love it phenomenal. Phenomenal at the scope of this thing. It's incredible. Laravel is a full-on ecosystem. It's a technological web development ecosystem. It's like Google. Yeah, I'm going to compare Laravel to Google. Whereas Symfony has really good component libraries, follows really good architecture. And then you can compare that to Slim, where it's really micro and it can allow any PSR implementation to hook into it, as well as a lot of other stuff. Laravel does have its biases, but Laravel is a full-on ecosystem, people. Just to give you an idea, it may have started off as a PHP framework, but Laravel is now a full-on ecosystem, meaning this: it has the PHP framework, it has an admin scaffolding set up in Nova, it has a software as services implementation in Spark, it has Laravel itself obviously has a ton of tools like Laravel Tinker, Telescope for debugging. The debugging now they use I forget what it's called, but it's something flame debugging. They move past whoops. Their service container is extraordinarily biased, but it is freaking powerful. That service container is incredible. Their requests, their responses are just out of this world. Again, they don't necessarily follow PSR, but they are just so dang phenomenal to work with. It's incredible. The way it is built out, you have your controllers, the dependency injection. You want format validation? Inject a form request. Instead of the traditional request, a form request will extend the request, and then within that class, the form request class, you validate. That's an incredible pattern. Then you bring in Laravel Mix, which is a wrapper around Webpack. This is a PHP framework, and they made the cleanest wrapper around something that anybody who's ever worked with Webpack, they know how complex Webpack is. And Laravel, just because they felt like it, they made a wrapper around Webpack called Laravel Mix, and it's a Fluent API, and it can be used outside of Laravel. And I use it all the time outside of Laravel, and it's just the cleanest, most enjoyable thing to work with ever, And then you start throwing in Laravel Forge, which is a continuous integration system. It's for deploying any type of PHP website, and it's phenomenal to look at. It's so much better than something like You know, Jenkins, like, it's so much better. And I'm sure Jenkins has more flexibility and more options, but Forge is just so much easier to look at. Like, you can get Laravel Forge and set up in 20 minutes to get it installed. You have to have like a DigitalOcean server or an AWS server, and what Forge does is it will use, I'm pretty sure it uses Terraform behind the scenes, but it will hook into DigitalOcean and Amazon and, you know, Google Cloud's APIs to interact with servers. And it's literally an API wrapper around server deployment, around like website deployment. It's so clean. It's phenomenally clean. It's like a one-click button to get SSL certificate set up. Like, if you've ever deployed a website, that is got to be, and it's the easiest thing in the world, but it's just one of those things. There always seems like there's something to it. With Laravel Forge, it is a one-click button, and you got your SSL set up. You know, subdomain and otherwise. Like, it's incredible, you know. It has the ability to edit just the files you need to, and not all of them. It has the ability to switch between different PHP versions, to deploy based on a webhook that you have like connected to your GitHub. And it's just like, you just post your link to the GitHub repository this is related to, and then you say, hey, whenever you push to this, redeploy my site by grabbing the new code we just pushed to master, for example. Like, that's a Laravel thing, Laravel Forge. And then to top that off, this one blew my mind, because this is what I've been working on for the last year at my last company. It was cloud computing and AWS and Lambdas and serverless infrastructure using like Terraform, which is infrastructure as code, and some really, really complex, insane things that, like, it's not that it's overly complex, it's just that it's it's overly complex. And it's not overly complex, the power is huge, it's for horizontal scaling, and it's AWS does so many things, cloud computing does so many things. And guess what? Laravel Vapor, you want to know what that does? That is the same thing as a Laravel Forge for deployment to a monolithic server. Laravel Vapor is the same thing, but it's for deployment to a cloud infrastructure, which allows you to horizontally scale an application. Like, it's insane. You know, then you throw in like the entire request validation library they have. You throw in the migrations that Laravel has, you know, blueprint and schema. You throw in the fact that, you know, Eloquent itself is just, the ORM is incredible. It's incredible. Eloquent is, oh my god. And then you just keep throwing it in. Like, the most recent thing is they allow you to they created a wrapper around Guzzle HTTP request. Laravel created a wrapper around Guzzle HTTP request. That's incredible. You know, Laravel Sanctum, like, oh my gosh, like, you can just keep going on, and it blows my mind. It's incredible. And Artisan, Laravel Artisan, like, God, they just do it the easiest. They just make it so easy to make an Artisan console command, you know, instead of having like an array of arguments, like a function that returns an array of arguments, which is what I did when I made a console. They set it up so that I've been in the code, in the source code lately, just trying to figure out how they did that. They have a regex requests, regular expressions that go in and parse the Artisan command arguments and options and look for like the dashes to see if an option, like regex request. That way, whenever you make an Artisan command, you can just write out the exact syntax of the given command instead of having to return like an array of arguments. Like, write it how it's gonna be, make that a part of the name, the signature of the Artisan command, you know. And it's just like, golly, it just keeps going on, and it's insane. It is insane. And then top that off, they have like Laracast, which is they're just amazingly documented, and they have a dedicated website video documentation. And it is surreal how big Laravel is, how much functionality is in it, and it just, the ecosystem is just starting to grow exponentially. Taylor Otwell is just amazing. He is an amazing software engineer, but open source marketing to the extent of gaining contributions, as well as just continually personally building. He is just an extraordinaire. He's an extraordinaire. Jeffrey Way's an extraordinaire. And just the core team members on Laravel, man, it blows my mind. And Laravel, it wouldn't exist without Symfony. Without Symfony's component library, Laravel wouldn't be able to make all of these just incredible wrappers around Symfony and just make it so dang easy. It's just surreal. At the rate that Laravel's going, at the path that is like no other framework that tries to compete with them is going to stand a chance. So CodeIgniter and CakePHP and all of these frameworks that are full-fledged frameworks, they're not going to stand a chance, in my opinion. They're just too far behind at this point. What sold me was Laravel Vapor, man. Laravel Vapor, that blew my mind. I literally spent a year just banging my head against a wall trying to understand this AWS, cloud computing, lambdas, serverless. What does it mean to be serverless? What do you mean I can't send in a console request or whatever directly to my application because it will be triggered 8 times because we have multiple copies of the same application, to help with load balancing and horizontal flow of information and scaling. And it's what do you mean? And it's crazy. As soon as I felt like I started to get my head around it, it's just insane. I remember the week before that, I was like, I'm finally getting this stuff. I'm getting cloud computing. And then Laravel came out with Vapor, and I'm just like, well, that would have been nice a year ago. I would have really loved that. That would have been crazy.